Well, let's move along a little bit to the ecumenical councils of the church. And I think an important quote that's worth remembering is, the religious authority for Orthodox Christianity is not the Pope, as in Roman Catholicism, nor the individual Christian with his Bible, as in the Protestant and the Lutheran tradition, but the Scriptures as interpreted by the 7 ecumenical councils of the Church. Now that's an interesting one, and I think we need to take that with seriousness. So we're going to take a little look at those ecumenical councils. From the 4th to the 8th, 9th centuries, there were 7 ecumenical councils. That is, councils that embraced the whole church. And that's before the division of the church, so that included everybody that was naming the name of Jesus was at least supposedly represented. They explored doctrinal issues that were serious. And those issues were Main Street stuff. I mean, those were issues that were talked about in the coffee shop, on the golf course, wherever, whatever their life was back then. Those were topics that were seriously considered. You had a position on these different doctrinal issues. Again, those of you that were here a couple of years ago when we looked at the first Nicene Council, where you had Arius and Athanasius arguing about was Jesus true God or not, and out of this came our Nicene Creed. So the first issues of the 2 councils had to do with the relationship of God the Father to Jesus. And that was resolved in the Nicene Creed, and it was supported again in Constantinople a few years later. So you had that issue dealt with and sort of resolved, and the church is pretty much settled that that's where it's at. The next 3 councils dealt with the person of Jesus. And the key one was Chalcedon, and that we talked about last November, where that had to do with how is Jesus both true God and true man. And there was a branch of the church that really emphasized the divinity of Jesus, and therefore they called Mary the Mother of God. And this is the Virgin Mary Theotokos, the Mother of God icon, that was part of that whole tradition. So the church struggled for 3 ecumenical councils over how to identify who Jesus is, true God, true man. Martin Luther came up, we agreed with a very simple answer in the Catechism. I believe that Jesus Christ, true God, begotten of the Father from eternity, and also true man, born of the Virgin Mary, is my Lord. I'm not sure that would have flown by in the early church. They would have argued with that one distinctly. But at any rate, those were the issues that struggled the church, that formed the Oriental Orthodox. The Coptics came out of that side of the debate. The third issue that involved the last 2 councils had to do with icons. It was the Icon Controversy. Now an icon is this displayed one that, can you see that over here? We received this as a gift from Father Casimotes when we were doing a sharing on I think it was a Reformation type of evening at church, and he brought that as a gift to our congregation. But an icon is simply a visual representation of Christ, or Mary, or the angels, or the saints. It might take the form of a painted panel of wood, as this one does. It could be a mosaic, or it could be a fresco that's painted on the side of a church wall, an embroidery, a portrait that's on metal. Statues, the 3-dimensional, are really extremely rare in the East. You don't find very many of them in the Eastern Church. A controversy arose that lasted for a long, long time over icons in the life of the church. And I want to talk a bit about that today and see where that leads us. Those who venerated the icons saw them as absolutely fundamental to their faith. You really couldn't worship without the use of the icon as part of your worship. Jesus Christ took a fully human body, and thus the argument went, it is possible to portray his face and his form in line and in color. Icons for them are a guarantee that the incarnation really happened, that God really did take on human flesh and blood. Now they refute the charge that there's idolatry because they make a careful distinction. Worship is given only to God, but veneration is given to the icons, and they treat them with great care. Remember, like this woman here lighting the candles, but a moment later she might be over with a cloth polishing the icons as worship was going on. Just that constant touching and the handling of the icons. They appealed to the teaching value of the icons. They are open books to remind us of God. What speech is to the ear, the icon is to the eye. Now, we have really venerated speech. Have we not in the Lutheran Church? I mean, the sermon is by and large speech. It appeals to our ears and to our hearts. The Orthodox Church say the icon does this for us to the eye. God may be worshipped and His glory made manifest not only through words then, but through wood and paint. The fact that the human person is made in the image and likeness of God means that the making of an icon is in some way a kind of divine work. It's an Orthodox act of liturgy. Liturgy is unthinkable without the presence of the icons. The icons possess grace and convey sacramental value. That was all well and good, except you had a couple of things that were happening. There was an emperor, Leo, in about 717 that became terribly impressed with what the Muslims were doing. Muslims do not venerate any kind of physical form. And he bought into that in a big way and wound up influencing the Patriarch and influencing the Church. So for decades after decades, icons and visual things were pulled out of the churches, cast aside. Babushkas, the grandmothers, would sometimes grab the icon and hide it in their homes, put it up in the bedrooms as a way of worship. They were the preservers, along with monks. And the nuns of the church had a great veneration for the icons. And they too were caretakers and guardians of the icons in the life of the church. Well, the struggle went on for many, many centuries. But it didn't reflect just the difference that Islam had. And I recall when we talked last November about the Oriental Orthodox, how careful those Oriental Orthodox, the Coptics and some of them, were about putting visual images in the church because they knew it was offensive to Muslim people. The roots of this go back both to the Greeks and to the Jews. When you think of, have some of you been to Athens? And the sculptures that you find of often human but often divine forms. Was it in the 19th chapter of Acts that Paul takes out after the shaping of the Artemis, the statues that were being created and sold at profit, and objected strongly to that? So you had the Greek tradition had a lot of statuary. That was very common, and that has flown nicely into the Roman Catholic Church as well. But then you had the Jewish tradition. And the Jewish tradition has, thou shalt not make any, what's the word? Graven images. All right, now we want to go to an interesting little experience with that. What's the second commandment that you learned as a Lutheran from the Catechism?
Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord your God in vain.
Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. If you were a Jew, what is the second commandment? Thou shalt have no graven images. Back in the earliest century, St. Augustine, Paul, about the 6th century, St. Augustine renumbered the commandments. And he somehow maneuvered the first one to embrace, I am the Lord your God, you shall have no other gods before me, right? And he jumped to the next one, which Marv had, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. He wound up at the end with a problem, so what did he do? He took coveting and made a 9th and a 10th commandment. So you have the Jewish tradition and a whole lot of the other part of the Christian family went a separate way. Roman Catholics followed St. Augustine all the way. That's still the way they name them. Along comes Martin Luther. He was still a good Catholic in his tradition. He kept the same numbering that St. Augustine had. Therefore, you have nothing in our catechism about the graven images. It's not really, there is that one that says, what does God say about all these commandments? It's the conclusion to the commandments, you know. He pulls a little bit about, I, the Lord, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquities of the fathers. But that's part of the statement in the second commandment. But I think that's a fascinating way in which that whole thing has been reworked. And we might have expected the Orthodox to do the same, but they didn't. They have kept the Jewish numbering of the commandments, but they've observed it to the letter of the law. So what does graven mean? Something you create with hands, you know. You shape, you sculpt. So what did they do? It's on a flat plane. There's no three-dimensional to it. And it's something that they have taken very, very seriously in terms of their following that image. So the image that the Orthodox, the par excellence image, is the icon. And the churches, the iconostasis that divides the kind of the Holy of Holies spot in the Orthodox Church from where the people are, it's just full of the icons and the gold that are on the faces of those spaces. They are tremendously important for the Orthodox people. Well, in the Western Church, again, we have statues of the Virgin Mary, so many of those. In the Lutheran Church, we seem to have stuck with stained glass and the cross has sort of been our take on the art side of it. Along comes Empress Theodora, who finally got rid of that problem of those who opposed the icons. And she ordered the Patriarch to restore the icons to the churches. And so a date is terribly important. March 11th, 843. It's probably the most significant feast day for the Orthodox Church. It's the feast day of orthodoxy. And so if there's a point at which orthodoxy becomes a vital living creature, it's in 843. Icons from then on are essential to the Orthodox tradition. Now, there are those that say following that 843, orthodoxy tended to level off. Some would say it tended to stifle and lose some of its vitality. But nevertheless, it's the point in which they articulated what they understood to be the core and the heart